We are very excited to have you here with us for the Global Symposium. The last time we had our Global Symposium was back in 2019, and someone reminded me this morning that I was also MC at that event. So I guess we have a lot of continuity there, and I'm sure there are many people here who were also with us at that time. So it's great to be back together as an ISEAL community and to have really important conversations today about how the emerging due diligence framework and regulation is changing the way we think about and what we need to do in order to advance on our sustainability goals. So first, just some housekeeping reminders. So there are no fire drills planned. That means if there is a fire drill, we do actually need to go outside. Please follow the exit signs and meet in front of the building. There is a coat rack in the foyer that you may have seen. You can leave your coats there. You can also leave your luggage there. You're also welcome to leave your luggage at the reception of the two hotels we're working with, so Trafo and Blue City hotels. We do have a live stream audience today with us, so those of you who are joining us live stream may know that we almost have a full room here, and we also have more people online, so welcome to all of you. And just also a reminder for people here that we will have moments where we're using different approaches to getting questions so that we can also hear from those who are with us online. Again, I'll go back to, you've got the Wi-Fi and password there for your needs, because we are going to be using the Swap Card app. So we would like all of you to have access to that on your phone. And to note that we will be doing some videoing and photographing during the event. So hopefully, if you have any problems with that, let us know. But otherwise, we hope to get some great images of our time here today. Again, welcome and very much thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm looking forward to a lot of interesting content and hopefully a lively discussion, both in the sessions but also during the breaks. Most of you probably know ISEAL, but for those of you who don't, I'd like to just say a few words about who we are. We are a membership organization. We work with sustainability systems like standards and certification organizations, standard setting bodies. We work together with the standard systems and their partners to try to tackle some of the most challenging sustainability issues that the world is facing today. We are an NGO. We are based in London, and there are around 50 of us these days. Many of my colleagues are here today, so I do encourage you to reach out to any of us and get to know what all of us do. Again, the focus here is on sustainability and due diligence and what that means for the future. What are the opportunities for companies? What are the opportunities for sustainability systems? What are we going to have to do? What do we need to do? What problems do we need to solve in order to make sure that we continue to achieve our sustainability objectives going forward? I mentioned that we're going to be using Swap Card. So to get you going with Swap Card, I'm going to ask you to pull out this Swap Card app and follow these instructions. So if you go to the first page and then you go to Agenda, you can find the sessions that we're talking about today. So we're in morning plenary sessions. So you can click on there. And once you get there, you'll see either this little chat sign or you'll see something that says join the conversation. If you click on there, you should get to a next piece that says chat, questions, and polls. So right now we're going to do the polls. In some of the sessions, we're going to ask you to use the questions piece. But right now we're talking about polls. So if we could pull up the first poll. Okay, so answer the question to the first poll. And you should start to see the answers come up already. So the first question was, why did you join today, and of course my boss made me come. Thank you, Karin. But we can see that many people are here for knowledge building and also for networking, so let's definitely make good on that promise. The second poll, how much of your job is focused on due diligence and emerging due diligence legislation? We have some people who are working on it full time, but most of us, half of us, are saying it's not central to a job but affects our work. Right? So we have some experts in the room and many more of us who really want to understand what it means for us. We have over 30 speakers with us today, informed and experts on many different topics. We want to thank all of the speakers for being with us today. It really makes it an exciting event. Okay, to get us started now, I'm going to call on my boss, so Karin Kreider, Executive Director of ISEAL, to come and share opening remarks. Karin?
Thank you, Kristen. Those of you who know me know that I'm not really one to make people do things, so that was interesting. Welcome, everyone, to ISEAL's 2024 Global Sustainability Symposium. It's an exciting moment for us. As Kristen mentioned, it's been a gap of 5 years since we've had this global flagship event in person, and so we're really, really pleased to be here in person with you, and in this new world, virtually as well, with many of you who are participating online. So this 5 years may not seem like very long to many of us, but I think we can say that the world is a different place than it was in 2019 when we had our last event. In these 5 years, many things have shifted. The way business works, the way our work, fundamental changes. We've lived through a global pandemic that threw life out of gear, disrupted business and supply chains, but it also highlighted why it's critical to invest in sustainability and who suffers most when we don't. We live in a more uncertain world, rising tensions, shifting demographics, unpredictable political winds, and the planet is heating up. And although important climate commitments are on the table, achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is looking difficult. For those of us working in sustainability, this is an unprecedented time. Unprecedented in terms of the scale and urgency of the challenges that we face, but also unprecedented in terms of the opportunities we have to collaborate and partner with each other to drive positive change. The regulatory landscape governing sustainability and corporate action has shifted fundamentally in these last 5 years as well. From within the EU alone, we're looking at 6 major legislations covering corporate due diligence, reporting, green claims, empowering consumers, deforestation, and forced labor. But this Brussels effect is likely to trigger similar legislation in other major markets, not just Europe, but also the US, China, India, and Brazil. And we think this is good news. We've asked for these regulations for many years, as have NGOs, academics, and lead businesses. Regulation is needed to help set the bar for minimum expectation from companies. But while regulation is welcome, there are also many questions being raised about its implementation and likely impact. We're hearing from concerns from companies about the likely reporting burden and whether these new laws are going to create a bureaucratic nightmare with little real results. ISEAL facilitated dialogues on emerging due diligence legislation in 3 major producer countries, India, Ghana, and Colombia. And across all 3, suppliers, producers, and local government bodies raised a range of concerns about these policies, from effectiveness and impact to whether they will crowd out small producers and SMEs. Most critically, are these regulations going to end up hurting those who need the most support in accessing markets and shifting practices? And as we welcome these policies, we also have to acknowledge that there are some who think that regulation is the only answer and that voluntary tools are no longer relevant. We think they couldn't be more wrong. As a tool to guide market action on sustainability, voluntary standards have been around for over 30 years. Over time, they've evolved into what we call sustainability systems that define criteria, verify improvement, report progress, and build capacity to advance on sustainability. And crucially, these systems know what it takes to implement sustainability on the ground with brands and retailers, but also with farmers, foresters, fisheries, and factories across the globe. New rules and regulations are only effective if their implementation is sound. Voluntary sustainability systems have those decades of experience in putting sustainability into practice, and this experience matters because it can guide regulations to be more effective, holistic, and inclusive. You'll hear a lot of that experience coming through in the conversations today. ISEAL believes that alongside mandatory measures, voluntary measures can have a clear role in continuing to drive supply chain sustainability. And this is why we're hosting this conversation today. If mandatory and voluntary tools work together in tandem, collaborating with business, we'll progress faster to make sustainable supply chains the norm. ISEAL exists to accelerate positive change by improving the impacts of ambitious sustainability systems and their partners. We've worked for 2 decades with voluntary schemes, supporting them to be more effective and impactful. ISEAL started off as a collective of 6 schemes in 2002, and we're now a community of over 45 organizations who lead voluntary action on sustainability across sectors. We support our members in making their standards and systems stronger so that they can deepen impact and tackle difficult sustainability challenges with transparency and credibility. Our credibility tools, the ISEAL credibility principles, and the newly launched ISEAL Code of Good Practice for Sustainability Systems have been guiding this work. We know these tools are being used to guide company action and policy development. And we believe their use can be scaled up even more in the new regulatory environment to ensure that credible practices guide the implementation of these important laws. Through the sessions today, you'll hear from a range of ISEAL members, old and new, on how they are driving partnerships with businesses and producers to deliver impact on the ground. Equally, you'll hear from companies and others on where more change and innovation is needed for voluntary tools to achieve their potential, to meet new expectations, and support making regulation effective. We're at that pivotal moment in the effort to make markets a force for good. The coming decade presents the greatest opportunity to turn our learnings into scalable action. And we could not be prouder to be opening up our space and symposium to have this dialogue on how we can achieve that shared goal. I started by noting how the world is a very different place today than it was 5 years back. One of those big shifts is how good we've gotten at virtual brainstorming and dialogue. So we asked ourselves, what do we really want to achieve with an in-person event bringing 200 people together in Switzerland that we could not achieve over a 2-hour virtual meeting? The answer is conversation, shared creativity, and problem solving. That sense of being in this together, building relationships. Because it's only through working together can we holistically tackle the sustainability challenges we face today. And building those face-to-face relationships helps to spark new ideas or hear a different point of view. So as we go through today, I want all of you to keep these 3 questions in mind. What is it going to take to mainstream sustainability in the coming decade? What role do each of us have to play in getting there? And how do we need to work together to achieve that goal? So I welcome each of you to take advantage of this unique opportunity today, contribute to the conversation, meet someone new, take away some new ideas. And finally, before we dive straight into our first session for the day, I want to note how especially happy ISEAL is to be bringing our flagship symposium back to Switzerland. We were last here for our 2017 Global Sustainability Standards Conference in Zurich, and we are deeply grateful for the support of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, who've been a longstanding supporter of and partner of ISEAL and many other organizations in this space. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Ambassador Ivo Germann. Ambassador Germann is head of the Foreign Economic Affairs Directorate at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO. His previous roles have included heading the macroeconomic support section within SECO, head of the economic, trade, and financial affairs at the Swiss Embassy in Washington, and Chief Economist with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. Ambassador, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, dear Karin and Christine, ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, to the ISEAL Symposium 2024 here at the Trafo in Baden. And wow, what an inspiring space this is. In an earlier life, I used to help setting up a jazz festival in Zurich. And we used to be in a hall that was quite similar to this. So I really hope that you're going to rock this stage today. But let's stay a bit with this hall. Let's dive a bit into Switzerland's economic history, because back in Zurich, we also used to be in an old industrial space. So we are here currently in one of the former factories of Braun Boveri and Company. Have you heard of Braun Boveri? For now, what we hear is ABB. But that goes back to Braun Boveri brothers, and the company later merged with the Swedish ISEAL to become ABB. So for once, you know, when we were taken as Swedes and the Swedes for Swiss, we just shrugged our shoulders and said we joined forces to one of the most powerful industrial companies and one of Switzerland's most successful companies in the machinery sector. So I really hope that the spirit of the electric transformers that used to be built in these buildings will also energize our discussions today. In Switzerland, as well as in many other countries, regulations on deforestation, due diligence, and sustainability reporting are on the rise. It is clear that with EU regulations such as CSDDD or EUDR, all companies need to reflect on their responsibility for upstream providers. And it is also clear that such regulations, even though adopted at the EU level only, have important impacts on Swiss companies too. And at SECO, I also coordinate our ongoing negotiations with the EU Commission. And almost on a daily basis, we are in touch with the Swiss industry. We hear about their, well, sometimes complaints, but also questions on how we can navigate through this emerging environment of regulations. The key topic of our discussion throughout this day is the role that sustainability standard systems can play in this changing regulatory environment. Actually, it might be seen as a bit ironic, no? That voluntary standards, which to a certain extent emerged due to a lack of public regulations, now have to define themselves anew in view of upcoming regulations. Critics may say that voluntary systems have not been powerful enough to lead to systemic transformation of production systems, and that more stringent mandatory rules are thus needed. By the way, on a personal note, I always said even if there's regulation coming, if you had a powerful and good and strong and relevant and credible voluntary standard beforehand, well, the costs of adopting to new regulation will, of course, decrease against other competitors who have not made that step. We would argue that voluntary system standards have nevertheless made a significant contribution to more sustainable production systems, well beyond raising awareness on the importance of sustainability issues among consumers. And we are convinced that they will continue to play an important role in the implementation of new public sustainability regulations in the future too. Over the past decades, voluntary standards have accumulated a wealth of experience in driving sustainable production systems and value chains. Of course, they're not perfect and still present certain flaws. A recent article in a well-known Swiss consumer magazine has, for instance, raised concerns on working conditions in certified flower farms in Kenya. Similarly, a fatal accident in a certified small-scale gold mine in Peru last year has led to public criticism regarding an initiative supported by SECO for many years. And I'm sure you've all seen Also on an international level, the press that has been criticizing the program, we stuck to it, we worked with it in order to improve the situation, we learn from it. But this criticism has to be taken seriously as it sheds a light on so far dark spots of existing standards and sustainability initiatives. They are important elements on our learning journey. At the same time, they should not lead us to fundamentally question the whole system and throw all the positive experience overboard. SECO has been a long-standing and strong supporter of voluntary sustainability standards. What has started in the early 90s with seed funding to the Swiss fair trade organization Max Havelaar and other international sustainability standard systems has over time evolved into a broad partnership with ISEAL and other international organizations active in this space, such as the ITC. Switzerland has an interest that these investments continue to deliver a development impact. Whilst we acknowledge the potential benefits of more stringent regulation, we also see, and I'm sure you agree, some risks. First and foremost, such risks are related to smallholder farmers in poor producing countries that might not be able to prove compliance with new regulatory requirements. Adopting a pure compliance perspective, companies might refrain to engage in riskier contexts. In addition, there is an important risk that compliance costs will be passed on to producers. All this might lead to further deteriorating smallholders' livelihoods, possibly leading to more and not less child labor, to just take this example, or deforestation and other unsustainable practices. I've just returned from Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, where I spent a week with an economic delegation, and many stakeholders, be it from the private side, but even in our discussions with our governmental counterparts, such issues were raised and concerns were brought to my attention. So we have to take this into account when we think about regulation and their link to voluntary standard systems. But let me be clear, I'm not a priori against new regulations. Even if at SECO we primarily advocate for voluntary initiatives and market-based mechanisms, time has shown that they are not sufficient to fight unsustainable production practices. In some cases, mandatory regulation is therefore necessary. But we should be careful not to over-regulate, and therefore a smart mix of mandatory and voluntary mechanisms is necessary. And I think that's what we are here for today, to discuss in a constructive and also creative manner how these systems can, reinforce each other. In Switzerland, we have recently adopted such a combination of public and private mechanisms. As you might already have heard, in our comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia, the SEPA, the free trade agreement, tariff concessions for sustainably produced palm oil were included. For the implementation of this provision, following a thorough benchmarking exercise, we have opted to rely on existing voluntary standards, namely the RSPO. Also, we accompany the SEPA provisions with concrete support, technical assistance to sustainable palm oil production landscapes in Indonesia. For us, this is an important example on how public and private systems can work together. And by the way, since everything is voted upon in Switzerland, of course there was a referendum on a free trade agreement, so Swiss public votes on a free trade agreement, and we won by just about 51%. And I'm sure that without these sustainability provisions on palm oil, because for many farmers palm oil is and was seen as a threat, we would not have won that vote. So you can see how important these standards can be also for the public perception. We are confident that in the future there will be many more such smart mix examples, and through our ongoing collaboration with ISEAL, and in particular through the ISEAL Innovations Fund, we strive to support standard systems in adapting to new regulatory environments. In addition, we hope to contribute to increased collaboration and harmonization of approaches between different standards. We would like to bring other countries into this discussion too, and are thus very happy that UK's FCDO has recently joined the ISEAL Innovations Fund. We welcome other donors to do the same. Our collaboration with ISEAL also seeks to increase the understanding of public and private actors regarding voluntary standard systems. Only if stakeholders understand the opportunities and limits of voluntary systems will they be able to most effectively use them for their own objectives. In this context, I'm very happy that this year's ISEAL Symposium is organized in Switzerland and that we have so many participants from early on in the morning representing both the Swiss public as well as the private sector. So, a big thank you to our partner ISEAL for the organization and to all of you for your active participation. I look forward to insightful and really energetic discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Germann, and also Karin Kreider for those opening remarks and for really setting the tone of why we're here and what we want to talk about today. I'd like to invite the next panel to come up to the floor, and while they're joining us on stage, I'll just tell you a little bit about where we're going this morning. We have 2 panel discussions, and then we will have a coffee break, and then we will have a 3rd panel discussion. So the breakouts are in the afternoon, so settle in for some interesting panel discussions today. To lead this panel, I'd like to introduce my colleague Patrick Mallet, ISEAL's Innovations Director, who will be moderating the session. Thank you.
So thanks, everyone. I'm missing a panelist. Has anyone seen Santiago? There you go. Right. So it is a pleasure, really a pleasure, to see so many familiar faces. It's so nice to be back here in person. And I feel very privileged to be facilitating this opening panel with a great lineup. We have Santiago Gowland, who's the CEO of Rainforest Alliance, Danielle Morley, the CEO of Bonsucro, Petra Hyde, who is Head of Sustainability at Halba, Switzerland, and Christian Robin, Executive Director, the Swiss Platform for Sustainable Cocoa. Thank you all for being here. It's great. This is a Game Changers panel, and really, I was excited to lead this panel in part because it's a fairly dynamic time for sustainability systems. The environment in which we're working, the involving regulatory context, the roles that sustainability systems can play in the sustainability transition it's potentially quite game-changing in the sense of there's a space for sustainability systems to really play a critical role in that transition. And that's what I want to talk about today. In this discussion, and I appreciate that we don't have a lot of time for this panel, I want to look at some of the systemic challenges that sustainability systems are trying to address and how we can get at that. I want to look at some of the challenges around data and information provision. And I really want to ensure that we understand how sustainability systems can be most effective in this new regulatory environment where due diligence and other regulations are playing such an important role. So my first question to you, Santiago, is just recognizing that some of the problems we're trying to solve, many of them, are systemic in nature. They're challenging, they're difficult. And I'm wondering how Rainforest Alliance is looking at those systemic challenges and what role partnerships and collaboration play, particularly highlighting maybe some of the work that you're doing around landscape approaches.
Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, very impressed by this convening. So let me start by maybe doing a bit of a progression of how the sector evolved, right? From the initial risk focus and compliance, where it was about understanding impacts, measuring them, the whole GRI beginnings, certification even, right? To the second wave, where companies began to realize, okay, we need to integrate this into our business, right? And I was 10 years at Unilever leading sustainability and the corporate brand, and our agenda was integration, brand imprint. How do we make this a competitive advantage for the company, right? And the same at Nike. And that was quite successful, actually, to evolve from risk mitigation into business value creation in a way. But it got us a little bit stuck in that sort of attribution, competition, etc. And of course, no single company can change any of these systemic issues. No matter how big the company is, you're a drop in the ocean, because most of this deforestation, human rights issues, biodiversity loss, they are really landscape level systemic issues. And they require a completely different side of the brain or side of the heart to be deployed, which is transcending that competitive advantage and engaging in transformative alliances, right? And in a way that you can really define what is pre-competitive, how can we join forces, how can we get a collective understanding of what are the issues and a shared vision of what are the solutions, and then drive together a more efficient implementation action that can distribute the cost, but more importantly than that, be even more effective at the solutions, right? So with the Rainforest Alliance, of course, alliance is part of our, at the center of our name, and we've done a lot of those efforts. You can look at the accountability framework, etc. But let me maybe hone into 4 elements that I believe are practical, So take a note. These are the 4 that I came up with. See if they make sense to you, right? So look, the first systemic issue is like the Tower of Babel syndrome. When everybody's speaking a different language, you don't understand each other. You can't really build anything. So the first thing is, how do you get to a common definition of things, right? Today, we have a big need, and this is where the Swiss Sustainable Cocoa Platform, the Global Coffee Platform, ISEAL are important with the regenerative strategy, right? And regenerative frameworks. We need clear definitions, because if we don't have a clear definition, there's no collaboration possible. So some of those alignments, right, that we try to do, for example, collaborating with the Global Coffee Platform, the Accountability Framework Initiative, the Regenerative Agriculture Framework, all of those, ISEAL even, all of those efforts are at the very core. Let's make sure we are calling things, we're all meaning the same thing with the definitions, right? The second issue is project fragmentation. When I was in Ghana with the board, I was talking with those 10 multinational companies sourcing cocoa from Ghana, all work with the Rainforest Alliance, and they're all doing their own little projects. You have like 10 child labor projects, entrepreneurial income accelerators. There's a reforestation project. None of them are collaborating. None of them are making a systemic shift. There's 1,000 flowers blooming, 1,000 anecdotes, no system change. Why? Right? This obsession with attribution, it's my project, it's my tree, it's my school, it's my whatever, right? That's a big problem. So how do we move from the mindset of projects to a mindset of transformative platforms, where we collaborate where it makes sense through pre-competitive collaboration? We differentiate on going further than the base, right? That's the second one. The third one, to the ambassador's words, is this combination between voluntary standards and policy. We need policy as well. Come on. For us, when the European Union come up with UDR, the Green Claims Directives, etc., we need those, because we need some compliance systems also to mainstream the agenda that we are pursuing, right? So I think that the work we do with the UDR, with the green claims, with the CES, DDD, etc., is very important, needs to remain a part of it. And the final one is a green finance, right? And so many times, the competition for resources, at least in the NGO sector, I spent 20 years in the private sector, and private sector tends to be competitive. Like Nike hates Adidas, but man, the competition in the NGO sector is none to be found anywhere in the private sector. So it's crazy, because we are supposed to be here for a shared purpose to see that in the short window we see actual, real transformation, genuine shifts in landscapes, etc. So we need to find better ways of harmonizing, collaborating, etc. as a sector.
Great. Thank you so much, Santiago. A lot of foundational issues there to put on the floor. I want to go next over to you, Christian. The Swiss Cocoa platform, I think, is a really good example of you don't need to do anything with your microphone. It'll work just fine. It's a really good example of how you can bring different stakeholders together to try to unify the purpose and approach. And it'd be great just to give a little context for the stakeholders that you do bring together, but also how they're helping to put forward national action plans and how that coherent approach at a national level really addresses or helps to address some of these systemic issues.
First of all, I would like to say that I'm really excited to be here again at an ISEAL conference. Also, I'd like to thank a lot ISEAL and the ISEAL team to make it possible that so many Swisscom members can participate to this symposium, that Swisscom members get acquainted with this standards family. And before starting to respond to your question, I would like to recall to the last conference ISEAL organized in Switzerland. It was 7 years ago. 25 kilometers from here in Zurich. It was precisely on that occasion that the Swiss platform for sustainable cocoa was launched. So it was an important moment for us, and it was for a reason, because we are very much inspired by this multi-stakeholder character of ISEAL and all the associated standard systems. This multi-stakeholder approach drives us. It makes us really passionate about to work in that manner. But of course, as a Swiss platform, we like to bring that to a national level. We involve more stakeholders, other stakeholders. For instance, we increased our membership from 40 to 100 members. We are with a lot of members which are maybe not a part of the inner circle of the standards community, smaller organizations, SMEs, but also public organizations, NGOs, service providers, which have become more and more important also when thinking of EUDR compliance, but more and more also financing organizations, impact financing organizations, and so on. And I could say now many things what we're doing, but I think it all boils down that our ambition is really to strengthen the network of actors who would like to move things, push sustainability in the cocoa value chain. And when speaking with members, what I mostly hear from companies and other members is, for us, Swissco is great because I can learn fast, quicker. It gives me arguments, it gives me examples which then I can use internally to make the case in the company, to allocate more resources, to make better choices. And this peer learning effort is so important. And of course, what is also important in our Swiss network, it creates more trust. And you know, I see, Patrick, that trust is really the key currency for collective action. And when we think of landscape approaches, as mentioned by Santiago, then we really need trust. We need to understand each other, and only then we can implement collective actions. But our community doesn't stop at the cocoa community. Also in Switzerland, we realized that we have a lot to share with other networks in Switzerland. For instance, even before Swissco, there was launched a soy network. There is also a palm oil network. And just the other day, also the Swiss coffee platform was launched. And particularly when discussing about EUDR, the implications, we realized that we have a common agenda. And for that reason, also we try to strengthen a lot these synergies between different platforms. But also at the international level, to finalize my contribution, for us it's very important to also partner with other European sister initiatives. Because if we speak and partner with big companies like Mars or Nestle or Lindt, of course we are stronger together. And there we are also very much motivated to push forward a common agenda with the other European initiatives.
Excellent, thank you so much. Petra, I want to come to you. Halba is maybe a company that is well known in Switzerland. I'm not sure if it's known so well outside of Switzerland. It would be great to just get a little context for not only the company, but some of the work that you do or support in country. I know that dynamic agroforestry has been a big part of the work, particularly in Ghana. You've engaged with some sustainability systems in that. From this systemic lens, can you talk a little bit about how you're helping cocoa producers to address some of those underlying challenges and maybe potentially the role that sustainability systems can play in supporting that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, hello everybody, and thank you for your invitation. And it's great to see you again, Patrick. It was a long time ago when we met the last time. So yes, Halba is a Swiss-based company. We are in the group of Coop, and we are B2B, so a lot are not really knowing us. We are a medium-sized company. We are producing about 20,000 tons of chocolates and 40,000 tons of snacks, and we are exporting also 50% of our chocolate also to other markets and to other clients, while our mother house Coop assumes 50%. And we realized already since years that cocoa is in crisis, and cocoa as a sustainability is, yes, the systemic. There are a lot of systemic problems in cocoa cultivation, and therefore we started certain projects with our cocoa producers, cocoa suppliers, to address these problems. Of course, all our cocoa suppliers are cooperatives, and they are fair trade and partly also Rainforest Alliance certified and also organic. So the standards are playing a very important role. They lay the ground for minimum requirements, to meet minimum requirements, but we were realizing that all these standards are not really helping us to solve all the problems we are facing there. Therefore, we started years ago already with dynamic agroforestry projects, helping our farmers to transform their often monoculture, non-sustainable cocoa plantation into a high diversified, high sustainable cocoa plantation where not only cocoa is growing, but also a lot of staple food for their daily consumption, and also fruits and other crops for local markets, in order to increase their income, minimize their risks for markets, and improve food sustainability and food security. And this is quite successful because farmers like that. We have a lot of benefits. Increasing income also solves a lot of social problems. So with this approach, we really can say that we are heading forward, and we can address a lot of problems and make the systemic change we are looking for. And so far, we started very small, and everybody was laughing to us and saying, well, with 1 or 2 hectares, what would you like to do? But now, after a while, we have more than 1,000 hectares. We have more than 1,500 farmers in these projects, and they are really lining up to get trainings and to be in these programs, because it's quite successful. With this, we cannot do without others. So also standard organizations are playing a role. We are working very close with Fairtrade Africa in Ghana. They are the expert on the ground. They are helping to implement the project. And they are starting to not only be a standard organization, but also a kind of developing cooperation organization, working closely with farmers, understanding their needs, and helping us really to implement, doing trainings, and being the ambassador and the link between the market and the producing countries.
Thanks, I appreciate that. One of the things that will come out in this panel is that there are many different roles that sustainability systems are starting to play, and so this capacity building is not new, but is an important aspect of the value that sustainability systems can bring. One of the other real values that sustainability systems have is access to data, a lot of good information and insight about performance and change and improvement over time and impact. Danielle, I want to come to you on this data question, because I know amongst the ISEAL members, Bonsucro is one of the metrics-based organizations that's been collecting data for a long time, but I think you're investing still quite a lot in improving that data platform and the flow of data through your system. Can you speak a little bit about the values that you see data can provide, both in impacts, but then in improving your system, and potentially a little bit about the role you see Bonsucro playing as a data provider?
Good, thank you for the question. I mean, the role of impact reporting is growing at a fast and furious pace. We can see that, we're hearing about it all the time, driven by disclosure, driven by due diligence, and it's applicable at all levels of supply chains, right? So it's applicable for products in terms of claims, it's applicable for projects, for example, the issuance of carbon credits, it's applicable across enterprises, around due diligence, around scope 3 and so on, and all of that relies on data. All of those disclosure and accountability mechanisms need credible data. So there's a huge pull in terms of like the market demand for more data, which is massively changing. In the sector we work in, Bonsucro is a sugarcane specific sustainability system. It's massively changing and having an impact on the ground, and it's having an impact on relationships between along the supply chain, because there has to be a deeper and different way of engaging between customer and supplier in order to unlock that flow of data. And so there's a real question about where's all this data going to come from? How credible is it? How do we unlock its value? How do we share it? How do we govern it? And it's a rapidly changing landscape. Luckily for Bonsucro, we have kind of data and metrics baked into our system, because the Bonsucro production standard since 2011 was designed as a metricated standard. We have over time built up a database of about 1 million data points. A third of those directly relate to audits, and then the other 2/3 relate to other data points relevant to the process of auditing. So we've got about 1 million data points built up over the past 14 years. Each audit provides around 300 data points, and it encompasses key metrics, and 70% of those are quantitative data, and about 30% are qualitative data, right? So that encompasses key metrics around GHG performance, water use, labor issues, wages, and so on. And so we Inbon Sucro needed to think about, right, what do we do with the value of that data? And so I've been very committed to working on improving our data pipeline, unlocking the value, and enabling that through digitization. So we've been on a journey really for the past 4 years, I would say. Started off by actually also enabled by ISEAL and the work that you did around data governance. And that was part of our journey that's part of becoming code compliant. We had to work on data governance. So we had to do data maturity assessments. We worked on data governance to understand the whole life cycle of, like, the data life cycle, to consider how is everybody a data steward, to do lots of work on data hygiene and all of these foundational aspects, and then really think about how do we change the way we work to enable us to build a better pipeline and to become more of a digital-first organization. So we're also working on improving our systems, and we're also looking at, for example, adopting agile working methods and so on. All of these are very foundational and very essential pieces of work that you have to do in order to unlock the value, in order to provide meaningful, accessible data down the value chain. So we've invested in that. We've built a data lake, so a cloud-based data lake. So we took everything from the Excel, and we've digitized all of that data recently, just in the past 8 months. And that has been a massive step forward, because that now enables us to do automated quality control of audit data, and to then start to use really powerful analytical tools to provide much deeper and richer insights into trends, because we've got, since 2011, we can analyze trends over time. And so we've focused at the moment on quite a lot of those internal-facing but really important foundational pieces. And looking forward, we're now starting to look at more external-facing tools and functionalities that will help accelerate sustainability in sugarcane by unlocking the value of this data supply chain, which in turn will incentivize more market demand for sustainable sugarcane, because not only do you get the sustainable sugarcane as a product, a physical product, you can also in parallel get all this great rich sustainability metrics through this other digital pipeline. So we're focusing on doing that. Excited about the potential, obviously, of AI and machine learning and what that can do for us, and that also speaks, I think, to the risk piece as well and risk mapping. And as I mentioned, some of the benefits are, I mean, I've spoken about some of them. It's about more informed decision making, a closer relationship between suppliers and customers. And then with that can then come more conversations and more collaboration, to your point around collective action, across the supply chain on collective action, using data to also identify, right, where do we need to address these big systemic issues, and what might be some of the ways we can do that.
Great, wow, yeah, and I think many sustainability systems are going through that same journey, and it's really nice to be able to bring the organizations together to have those conversations and to learn from each other through some of the ISEAL communities of practice. I recognize that I'm also managing time here, so in the next round of questions, if you can limit your responses to 2 minutes, that would be great. Literally. One of the final pieces of the puzzle that I want to put on the table is just recognizing that we're working in some cases with millions of small producers or small and medium-sized enterprises. It's challenging to imagine how we transform entire sectors. And part of that is about being able to provide the tools that producers and enterprises need at the time they need it, and to support them in a continual improvement journey, not so much about pass-fail certification, but really seeing this as a progress over time. And Santiago, I know Rainforest Alliance, this is embedded in your system. I'm wondering if you can speak to the role that continual improvement plays, particularly in the new system that has launched over the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you, Patrick. So, try in 2 minutes. So, here's a kind of the bad news, but also the good news, right? The bad news is that we are walking towards a cliff, right? The good news is that like every huge problem becomes a huge market very quickly, right? And this transition of agriculture towards a regenerative system is not anymore like a sustainability moral, issue. It is a survival issue because by 2050, you have 50% less land for coffee, and so this is a huge, so now when you think about that, right, when you think about the size of the price, the billions of dollars that are, dependent on the acceleration of that transition, then that changes the whole kind of dynamic of continuous improvement. Because whereas before, it was about giving a producer a premium, market access, training, etc. Today, it's giving survival tools for adaptation, resilience, productivity, quality, etc., right? And so the question then is, how do we create a system that, integrates irresistible benefits for the producer, like almost gamifying that to go from, like we did in the regen agriculture framework, from bronze to silver to gold. It's moving from a push model to a pull model by which the producer is incentivized to learn faster, adopt those, and then benefit. And for that, the certification standards need to be complemented by performance impact projects. It's not just about the practices, it's about the performance. In the Rainforest Alliance, 40% of our work is landscape and community projects. The other 60% is certification. So we are hardwiring the integration of performance and practices at each of the levels of continuous improvement. 2 minutes.
That was really good. Nailed it. Christian, let's come to this theme of due diligence, because I think given the scope of efforts that are underway, both to build out a due diligence regulatory framework and the implications that has, it is possible, if not likely, that some of these due diligence regulations are going to have potentially negative impacts on small producers, bureaucracy and burden of traceability. Can you speak a little to the roles that sustainability systems might be able to play to ensure effective implementation of some of these regulations?
Yeah. So, if I were a legislator, I would definitely very much lean on sustainability standards. And actually, it's very promising to see that there are governments, like the Swiss government, which have had some first examples in making an explicit use of sustainability standards to implement sustainability provisions in a free trade agreement or in a regulation. Now, I think with regard to EU, we know that the link is less explicit. It has been repeatedly said that yes, sustainability standards can help implement due diligence requirements and obligations, but still it's then the responsibility of each company to do the policy and implement it. Nevertheless, I mean, to support the implementation of due diligence requirements can mean a lot. And we just released yesterday an issue brief on the topic of child labor, which is probably the most challenging topic in the cocoa value chain. And there also we laid out how sustainability standards can support the implementation of due diligence requirement. And I mean, looking at the different steps, it starts in defining a policy commitment, but then doing risk assessment, afterwards defining mitigative measures. Then it's all about also tracking progress and also setting up grievance mechanisms. It's all there. The system is there. I think that's in that sense, yes, we strongly believe that sustainability standards, ISEAL member can play a pivotal role. But of course, we all know that the forthcoming regulation in the area of deforestation, CSCCC, the implementation, the jury is still out. But we all innovate and see attitude. But I strongly believe they have an important role to play, yes.
Thanks, and I think we'll see that one of the core messages coming out of the sessions today is really the variety of roles that sustainability systems can play in supporting companies in that way. Danielle, I want to come to you next. Just recognizing within the due diligence framework that risk assessment is a critical piece. It's a critical part of what companies need to do to understand risks in their supply chain. There's also, in some cases, national risk assessments to categorize countries according to risks for specific issues. Can you speak a little to the implications of those national risk categorizations and potentially what you see as some of the ways that sustainability systems can impact them?
Okay, thank you. It speaks a little bit also to what the ambassador was saying earlier in the opening session about, the potential problems of these approach is that we're dividing the world into kind of go, no-go zones. So how do we as sustainability standards operate within that context when what we're trying to do is capture as many actors as possible and take them on a journey of continuous improvement rather than, leave them out of the sphere of influence. So that's one aspect we have to consider. I think from the Bonsucro point of view, we adopted, we have a standard and we also have a code of conduct that relates to all of our members. We're a membership organization and we adopted our own kind of due diligence process a number of years ago because we realized we had to comply with the OECD requirements and do that. So to some extent, we've already been kind of de-risking a little bit our own membership. Through our intake of members, they have to go through a due diligence procedure. But I'd say just a couple of other points. One is continuously work on the credibility of our certification and assurance to enable those companies operating in those high-risk countries to demonstrate that they're reducing their risk through, for example, Bonsucro certification. The second one is working at these systemic issues and collective actions. We have a Bonsucro Impact Fund, which provides grants to producers and also facilitates collective action across the supply chain through investment from our Impact Fund. And we're also working increasingly in partnerships with apex organizations. And then I suppose finally, it's about the use of technology and how we can use technology better. For example, with SECO and corporate partners and ISEAL, you invested in a predictive modeling tool that we developed with the University of Minnesota. That could be an interesting, it was an interesting approach to seeing how can we use technology and big data to help companies make better decisions when they're operating in risky areas, and what would be the impact of standards if we adopt the RSPO or the rubber standard or Bonsucro, how that might reduce our risk within that landscape. So.
Thank you. Excellent. Appreciate that. Petra, I want to come with the last question to you. And in part, this is because from a due diligence perspective, this is ultimately a company obligation. And it's of top concern for many companies on how to adapt your systems. I'm interested in this interface between companies and sustainability systems. From a company perspective, what are some of the things you think sustainability systems can bring to support companies on their due diligence journey, but also maybe what are some of the ways that they need to evolve still to best support you?
Yeah, so from our perspective, it's very important that these voluntary standards are credible. So recognized standards are really helping us to minimize our risk in our supply chain. And so credibility is one very important thing. And with credibility comes also then consumer trust and market access and competitiveness. So in the moment when a consumer can make a decision about if I'm using a product with a label, with a sustainability label or not, so then they can actively influence certain impact in producing countries. So it's very important for us to have these labels and also to show that with these sustainability can be supported in or throughout the whole supply chain. And that also leads us to cost, energy, and time savings at the end. We are very thankful that these standard organizations, they are the expert, they are also the expert on the ground. We are here, our producers are far away, so how we close the gap? We close the gap by using a standard and voluntary standards, to step in and to help us to meet certain requirements. And how in the future, I think the balancing act will be to have high demanding quality, sustainability requirements in the standards, but also motivate that somebody wants still to go for that and fulfill them, and also making clear that how is this controllable? So you need experts to make sure that all these requirements we are putting there on the standards will be fulfilled. And this will be perhaps the challenge in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to bring this panel to a close and just appreciate each of you, Santiago, Danielle, Petra, Christian. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And thanks for all of you.
Thank you very much to all of you for a very interesting discussion to get us started. We're going to move right into the next panel called the Rule Makers, and for that I'd like to invite all the panelists to the floor, and also my colleague Vidya, who is here, Vidya Ranjan, who is our Director of Policy and Engagement, will be moderating this session.
Thanks so much, Kristen. And now I'm missing 3 panelists. Could I invite Alex, Jimena, and Amanda to the stage as well, please? Thank you. Great. Well, this panel is called Rule Makers, but I think a more appropriate title for it would be Rule Making, because the rule makers are all dealing with the aftermath of what's happened in last week's EU parliamentary elections. But essentially, the next conversation we wanted to have at the start of today was about making sense of what rules are being laid out for sustainability, what sense we can make of what they're going to change and what impact they're going to drive. And I think to kick off this conversation, I want to first acknowledge that rule-making is going to be pretty unpredictable over the next 5 years. We've heard in the morning that the last 5 years have been unprecedented in terms of the type of policies, the scale of policies that we're seeing coming out not only from Europe, but also from other countries. But this is also a year when we're going to see major elections happen. We've seen it happen in the EU, in India. The UK and the US are going into elections as well. And so there's no knowing which direction rulemaking is going to take. But I think one thing is clear in that there is a shift. And the conversation to be had is, how are we understanding that shift? How are we understanding that shift as sustainability systems, as companies? What can we expect will change, what will not change, and most importantly, how do we respond? So to have that conversation, we're joined by 4 excellent panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then kick off the discussion. We have Amanda. Amanda Soler Guzman is Advocacy and Engagement Advisor at Amphori. We have Alex Kunz. Alex is the Swiss National Contact Point for the OECD guidelines, multinational enterprises. We have Janina. Janina Grabs is an Associate Professor of Sustainability at the University of Basel. And we have Jimena Serrano. Jimena is the Deputy Director of Quality and Sustainability with ProColombia and also associated with their Ministry of Tourism, Industry and Commerce. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to this conversation. Janina, let's kick off with you. You've been studying sustainability governance for close to a decade now. You've studied voluntary tools for a very long time, and now we have a whole range of mandatory tools coming into force. Help our audience understand, what do you think is fundamentally going to change now in the way sustainability is governed?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's a great question. I think I'll build on a couple of things that we were already discussing in the previous panel. If we zoom out sort of from a macro perspective, the way that we've seen sustainability governance and global value chains work over the last basically 30 years, right, has been very much market-based, market-driven. So as our colleague said, Santiago, there is this idea that there's a market for sustainability, that specifically in niche markets, consumers are willing to pay for this, and that there's the need to create sort of the supply for this. And so we've seen voluntary sustainability standards develop, institutionalize, grow, but also reach potentially sort of the maximum scale that they have in terms of the demand that we see. We've seen company internal sustainability programs, in-house standards emerge, and also, and more recently, a discussion that we need to focus not only on single supply chains, but also at the land scale, at the landscape basis, and looking into jurisdictional approaches. And so now where this new legislations are coming in, I think it's going to create a number of sort of like rethinking, right? We've talked a bit about this is setting a common floor for compliance, which means that a certain amount of sustainability in supply chains is not going to be a competitive differentiation criteria anymore. Everybody has to do it. This, to me, means 2 things. On the one hand, there's still a lot of actors out there that are not currently in this boat that we need to bring into the boat, and we need to think carefully about how to create collaborative sharing of information, of tools, such that both smaller companies that maybe haven't had the brand exposure to need to do and invest in these types of systems, that they can come on board, but also that we can have more and more of the total supply chain that is able to come on board. We see a lot that at this point, sustainable supply chains are only a smaller part of the whole, that we see certification in specific types of locations or producer groups, and these questions of indirect supply chains that are more difficult to reach, like the producer on the ground, these also need to be taken on board. So, and that also then means that we'll have to think about where does the differentiation criteria lie in the future, right? How do we raise the bar for competition over sustainability? And how do we maintain that ambition to go further, even though currently there is going to be a lot of attention and focus in actually meeting some of the demands and also meeting the reporting requirements, showcasing the efforts that have been done in the past. Maybe one last thing that is interesting to me is to what extent company internally sustainability as a concept is now moving from communications maybe, or of course a lot of times sustainability departments have also sort of been framed in an innovation perspective to a compliance framing, which is quite different, right, from sort of this innovation, and we need to move further. We want to brand ourselves with these projects towards something that's much more risk-focused. I think there's big opportunities here to have more comprehensive, holistic approaches that reach through the entire company and through the entire supply chain, and not only focused on sort of standalone projects, but there is also a risk of having too much of a risk mitigation perspective and maybe leaving out these opportunities for further action by making it too legalistic and too liability focused.
Thanks, Janina. Thanks for laying that out. Let me come to you, Amanda. As Amphori, you work with 2,500 companies across 50 countries. Some people argue that due diligence is not really new. Companies have been doing it for a very long time. And that may be true, but in your view, what do you think is fundamentally shifting for companies with these new legislations?
Thank you so much, and I do agree, due diligence is definitely not a new concept. We've been supporting our members implementing due diligence standards and principles for the past 20 years at least. At the introduction, and it was also mentioned before that the policy landscape is becoming or might be unpredictable in the coming years. And I must say I can partially agree, but I would like to challenge that statement. I think, again, due diligence is definitely not a new concept, and it really saw a key moment in 2011 with the publication of the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which actually set the expectations, they set the standards for due diligence. And in doing so, they've become the norm of expected conduct for companies, but not only for companies, also for legislators to actually develop legislation that embeds the principles. And so one thing that we've been telling to our members, to companies, is do not wait for legislation to come. Do start now preparing yourself, understanding the key principles of those standards, because it's very likely that the legislation will actually reflect on those, and this is something that we are seeing now. So the new trend is actually not due diligence per se, is as Janina said before, the actual translation of those, let's say, standards on due diligence into actual legally binding obligations. And I think we can extract, I'll try to be quick, a few elements from that. So first of all, companies are expected to embed due diligence at the very core of their business, I think, and their strategy. I think this was also mentioned in the previous panel. A second very important conclusion is that companies are also expected to look beyond their own operations and even direct suppliers. So it's really a focus on the whole value chain. And thirdly, it's impact-based. So companies are no longer expected to measure, to look into sustainability matters in how or to prioritize them based on the impact in the financials, but really also looking into the actual impact in people and the planet on a prioritization, risk-based logic, so using the concept of severity and likelihood, and also to really track progress. I think progress is really at the core of the legislation, is at the core of the standards, so not only implementing actions, but really looking at the results and embedding that into the whole due diligence cycle. And with that also stakeholder engagement, which is critical, and we see this not only in due diligence legislation, but also for reporting, really underpinning the whole due diligence and transparency process, and particularly the engagement with stakeholders that might be potentially affected by those impacts. And then the last bit that I want to mention is transparency. I touched upon it a little bit just now, but really we see transparency at the core of the due diligence exercise. Transparency to be able to know your supply chain, to know where your impacts are, to be able to assess risk properly, and to be able to identify the stakeholders that you want to engage with. So voila, those are the main elements. And yeah, I think it's important that companies keep an eye on international standards, because they are and they will be and continue to be the inspiration for upcoming legislation.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Alex, let me come to you. In addition to a lot of these EU-level policies, we now know national governments are also writing company due diligence into law. In 2022, Switzerland passed the Swiss conflict minerals and child labor due diligence obligations. That aligns very closely with the policies that's coming out of the EU. Why, in your view, are we seeing this new wave of policy making emerge out of Europe?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for being here. First of all, I would say, I mean, the main engine is the EU regulatory machine, how we call it sometimes, and it's also affecting us in Switzerland, as the Swiss economy is very closely interrelated with the EU market. But there's also a very strong movement in Switzerland, the civil society movement. There's a coalition of corporate responsibility with over 100 NGOs, and actually they pushed for a referendum for legally binding instruments, and actually it was just very narrowly rejected by the Swiss population. Actually, the majority of the population was in favor of, but the majority of the cantons, because we needed double majority, was against it. But as a consequence of this referendum, an indirect counter-proposal of the Federal Council entered into force, and that's, as you mentioned, are those obligations regarding due diligence in child labor and conflict mineral and sustainability reporting. Maybe just another word, as how do we react to this EU legislation. Ambassador Germann already said we are not against legislation, but we should not overrule. So actually what we do is every time a new legislation comes up, we are very closely following this, analyzing it. We analyze the cost of regulation, the impacts, the positive, the negative impact. We also talk to many stakeholders, and you can imagine if you talk to a multinational company, you have one opinion. If you talk to a SME, you have another opinion. If you talk to the civil society, you have another opinion. But then at the end, based on all this information, the Federal Council takes a decision if we follow legislation or not. And just two examples, maybe on the CSRD, so the reporting directive of the EU. So there was a decision that we will go into the direction, we will be closely aligned with the EU directive, so there will be a public consultation starting actually in about 3 weeks. And there's another example of the EUDR. So this was also analyzed, and the Federal Council said, no, for the moment, we do not adapt the Swiss regulation, because as a Swiss company, you anyway, if you import to the EU, you have to comply. And first, we have to clarify issues like access to the information system in the EU and the mutual recognition. Because if we do a regulation in Switzerland, we would have a double regulation. So we really, our word is smart mix or also smart regulation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alex. And that's really interesting to hear an example of how a national government is thinking of translating and transposing this as well. Jimena, let me come to you. We've heard so far in the panel that the shift to mandatory measures is potentially good news for impacts on sustainability. It does mean a new shift for companies, but also there's a lot of uncertainty around what it's going to mean. As a senior Colombian government official, how is your government seeing this new wave of regulation coming from Europe? Do you think it's going to address the impacts of sustainability, or are there concerns here?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. For me, it's a privilege here in this event. Providing the context, a Colombian progress in sustainability is crucial for us, because our country has a strong history in this area. We are member of OECD from 2020, and we are implemented different policies as circular economy or deforestation control, sustainable tourism. We are target including 51 to reduce the greenhouse gas emission and zero deforestation into 2030. On the other hand, the Union of European stands Colombia's second largest trading partners, accounting for 12% of our exports. The main products to export we export to Union of Europe is coffee, cocoa, palm oil, flowers, fruits. In other words, More than 90% that our export is are agrobusiness to Europe Union. And given this context, for us it's very, very important to understand this type of regulations and understand what is the implication of our exports. And to this end, we implemented or conducted a study in order to identify what is the main gaps of our companies regarding to these type of regulations, and generally key several findings. First one is that the company in Colombia and in general in Latin America that engaged in selling this type of products are SMEs with supply chains comprising small producer families that depend of this business for dependence. And the expense to implement due diligence regulations is very expensive for this type of companies. Our research indicates that more than 80% of these companies implement good practices of sustainability. For example, forest conservation or renewable agriculture. However, the problem is how to demonstrate the due diligence, how to demonstrate this type of regulation, because this type of company has to invest in technology to apply the traceability or georeferencing. And it's very, very challenging for us and for the company in Colombia, in general in Latin America, demonstrate this type of regulation. On the other side, Colombia has a strong challenge or obstacles to combat the climate challenge, specifically the deforestation. Because the deforestation is linked to illegal crops and mining, not this type of crops, not cocoa, not coffee, not palm oil. So in this case, our government are implemented different programs or initiatives in order to replace this type of legal activities by cocoa, for example. And in this case, this type of regulation is a barrier for the farmers that cultivate in land that previously affected by deforestation. To conclude, for us, it's very, very important to understand this type of regulation, have in mind that we share the same objectives with the European Union, but it is important to understand the complexity of our supply chain, the complexity of our characteristics. And it's important to share the different experience and knowledge in order to comply this type of regulation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jimena. That's a really important set of perspectives to be bringing into the conversation. And I think the point you make that the government in Colombia, and as Karin said at the start, we also had due diligence workshops in India and Ghana over the last 2 years. And it's clear that the objectives are the same. And one can't assume that there is no commitment to sustainability, but how do you calibrate against what these new regulations are asking? And how do you demonstrate that compliance? So thank you for that. I want to shift gears a little bit to our next section and really then want to open up to some questions from the floor as well. As Jimena was saying, we want to understand what the implications of these legislations are. And so the next section I want to go into is really about what can we expect from compliance with them? What is going to change? We often talk about compliance with standards not achieving the level of impact that maybe we want to. What's compliance with legislation going to achieve, right? So Janina, let me come back to you. You've been studying the impacts of voluntary tools for a long time. What do you think is going to be the impact of these mandatory tools?
Well, it's very difficult to say because it really relies on how companies will actually move into compliance with them. I think there's sort of two possible futures. One is this minimum level trying to comply with the standard on the book, but maybe not sort of its ultimate aim. And then there's one way of complying that is much more ambitious. And I think where we really need to sort of like link to the discussion that we've been having in these collaborative settings more and more. Again, as I mentioned before, we know that single supply chain approaches are likely insufficient to tackle these complex sustainability problems on the ground. And so while the legislation per se, both the EUDR, the CSDDD, they target single companies and ask them to look into their supply chains. It's really important that the implementation efforts are done with these broader systemic approaches in mind and not just on a single supply chain by single supply chain level. So what we are likely to see, so most likely what we can see is that companies will do more traceability, will have better overviews of their supply chains. They may also move towards more simplified or more direct supply chains because that gives better overview of what's happening on the ground. But then especially the elements of risk mitigation or trying to move towards minimal or negligible risk, the way that it's called in the EUDR context. Here, we need to make sure that this actually happens via investing on the ground, via supporting activities that are already happening to improve the capacities of producers rather than pulling out of risk zones. And so I think this has already been mentioned. It's a little bit of a shame that in the EUDR, there's not really that much of an incentive to stay in deforestation hotspots because the way that it is written, there's not a lot of option for remediation possibilities for producers that have been sort of seen as deforesting. And I think they're making sure that we're moving into compliance in ways that is not, again, shifting supply chains towards the low-risk, best producers that are going to send their products to the EU and everybody else sends it to other markets will be important. I think in the CSDDD there's much more of an opportunity of that. If we read them together, obviously there's also going to be opportunities to work collectively on the ground. But just as a final thing, one element that I think is important is that these additional legislations obviously create more requirements in terms of tracing, in terms of reporting, but those need to be met with additional resources on top of the resources that have currently been spent in sustainability improvements on the ground, rather than shifting the resources that have been focused on, let's say, project work or producer support internally to finance these types of more administrative requirements.
Thanks, Janina. Amanda, let's come to you. People think, or there is a view that voluntary tools may be redundant or have less impact in this phase. We've already heard in the conference so far that mandatory and voluntary tools need to work together to be able to achieve that scale of impact. What are you hearing from your stakeholders within M4E?
Thank you. Yeah, I can only support that statement. I think that voluntary standards and mandatory legislation have actually a different but complementary role to play. So on the one hand, we have voluntary standards which basically set or take the aspirations of the market and translate them into implementable tools and guidance for companies. They drive continuous improvement. They help companies to be proactive, to build trust, to create value, and also importantly to, as I said before, influence upcoming legislation. But obviously, because of their aspirational nature, there's a limit to the amount of companies or the share of the market that they can reach in terms of sustainability. So obviously, as the market matures and voluntary standards are taking up more and more understood, there is a need for legislation to kick in and to actually, that's where the value is, to set this level playing field for companies to be able to compete in fair terms and to reward companies that have been investing time and effort into developing these core principles for due diligence and transparency. So yes, they are complementary, and then in terms of how to make them work together, I see it in two different ways that are also complementary. So first of all, alignment with the alignment of legislation with international standards and also the interoperability is really critical. Again, to be able to build on the expertise and the progress made by companies that have already been working, we said it before, for more than 20, 30 years, embedding this concept of due diligence and transparency. And then second of all, I think it's also very important to mention the alignment between the different pieces of legislation. We were talking about it now. So yeah, I think in this panel and the panel before, it's been mentioned the concept of thinking from a system perspective. And I really like that, because I think that the legislation should be built in a way that it considers the different steps that companies will need to take in order to comply. So what they need to do for due diligence, how do they set their materiality assessment, how do they engage with stakeholders, what methodology they use for assessing, identifying and assessing those risks. So I think as long as the core principles are clear and the interconnection with between the different pieces of legislation is clear, then companies have a place to start and to continuously improve and drive progress. So yeah, I'd say interoperability and also interconnection between the different pieces of legislation.
Thanks, Amanda. Alex, let me come to you. We've already heard that one of the key concerns from companies is that this new wave of regulation is going to tie them up in red tape and become a bureaucratic nightmare. There's a lot of companies in the room here today. So what is your office doing to try and sort of reduce the administrative burden? And where do you think voluntary tools can support?
Yes, thank you. Well, the administrative burden is really a big concern of us, and we receive a lot of calls from concerned companies, mostly SMEs, and those are SMEs from Switzerland, but of course there are either companies even more concerned, like in Colombia or in other countries. We don't receive those calls. So as SECO, we're working actually on two main levels. So one level is we're working towards a smart legislation. So for example, we are advocating for exemption of SMEs. So we have this role as SECO, but I can also share with you that it's not an easy role, because there are other departments in the Swiss government which, for example, advocate for 100% alignment with the EU regulation. So there are quite a lot of political debates. And on the other hand, the second level is like the support of the companies. So once the regulation are there, we're trying to support companies, and I would say one flagship initiatives are all the sector initiatives, which we have heard this morning with the cacao initiative, and now most recently, the coffee initiative. I personally believe very much in those more business-driven initiatives for the success for this. At the same time, we provide tools for the companies. We have a web portal on CSR. We have, the OECD guidelines, due diligence tools. So that's a little bit what we can do. Recently, we launched a CSR risk check. Actually, it's a cooperation with a Dutch organization, MVO Netherlands. And we also now it's accessible in Switzerland, and we have a cooperation with this instrument, and it's an easy to access instrument to assess your risks along for countries and also for different products. And maybe a little bit, you also ask about the role of the voluntary standards. I think we have to make the distinction between the companies directly concerned by the legislation. So those companies, there will be a shift towards the standards, for example, the European standards on reporting, the ESRS. Maybe the GRI will also play a role, but it's still not completely on the same level like the European standard. And for the due diligence, there's shift towards the OECD instruments or the UN guiding principles. But the voluntary standards, I think it's a really big momentum for the indirectly concerned companies in the supply chain. I mean, that's really the moment where you can prove with your standards like better cotton or FSC and so on, that for your customer to be, to fulfill the requirements from your customer. So I think there's really a big momentum there. I maybe just have one personal view. The word voluntary, I know it has been there for a long time, but the word voluntary, maybe there should be a reflection one day if we still need this word, because some stakeholders, they see voluntary as not credible. So this just like if you back to ISEAL, maybe to have a reflection on this one day, because the credibility will really be the key issue, and that's, I think, the role you are playing with ISEAL, to assure the credibility of those voluntary standards.
Thanks, Alex. Jimena, last question to you, and then I do want to try and squeeze in a few questions from the floor. What, in your view, what's the sort of support that you think is needed to help SMEs and smallholder farmers gain the most out of these regulations that will create actual impact?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, from the government in Latin America implement different interchange in order to know the good practice in other countries, between the countries. For example, different experience and knowledge in order to implement this type of regulation or the due diligence. Due diligence is more than a checklist, for example. For us, it's very, very important. It's a process that involves evaluate risks, creating policy. It's like a management system. So in this case, for us, it's very important to implement different tools to give easy to the different companies, especially SMEs, that you mentioned. For example, in our case, in ProColombia, we implement practical guidelines with recommendation to the company to implement the due diligence and describe this type of regulations according to our laws and our culture. And we have different trainings in order to apply this type of regulations.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, let's move to all of you. You all have been a very patient audience. I'm sure there's questions that you have. I think we have time for about 2 and maybe a third. So if I could request a bit more light on the audience in the room so we can see you. Great, thank you. And the floor is open. Could we have a mic here, please? Front. Thank you. If you can keep it brief, sir. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Torsten Arndt, Head of Advocacy for PEFC International. I'm wondering, what do you think about the risk of regulation, specifically EUDR, and deforestation-free becoming the new sustainable? Will it potentially be sufficient for companies and consumers alike to know that everything they're purchasing is deforestation-free as opposed to sustainable? Thank you.
Interesting question. Would anyone like to take that from the panel very quickly? Are we changing the definition of sustainable into specific terms like deforestation-free or forced labor-free, devoid of something rather than comprising of something? Janina?
Yeah, I think especially in the short term, there's definitely a risk of this, right? That we have a lot of attention, like focused, brought to these regulatory elements and issues that are being brought up by the legislation, and that we're sort of losing track of the big picture, both in terms of companies trying to move into compliance, also in terms of NGO or advocacy groups focusing on how can we make sure that these types of requirements are actually being met. So I think this is where we really need to make sure that we're continuing to amplify the debate and make sure that even if we have these mandatory rules that are important to comply with, there's other elements such as, for instance, climate change adaptation that still maintain really important, especially to producers on the ground, that we don't want to take energy and investments away from.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Anyone else? We have the lady here in front.
I can perhaps complement that question as well.
Sure, Amanda, if you want to share a quick thought on that question.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I would reiterate my point to think of sustainability as a system and to really stress, in case there's any policymakers in the room, but also for companies to really look at the intersection between the different policies. So I think CSDD, or Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the Reporting Directive, they look at it more from a sustainability from a systemic way. And of course, the EUDR, it's much more specific. We know that the logic is slightly different because, of course, it comes with a market ban, which alters a little bit the logic of due diligence. But they have different purposes. But what is at the base is, building your due diligence system, building your traceability. This is what we really need to consider and start working on. We have many members that already said, first things first. So we have started putting the pieces together internally, looking at what departments we need to involve, looking at what different policies, strategies we have, and bringing it together to create our due diligence structure and also data management structure. And this is where we need to start. And just to finish, I think the impact of the legislation and the EUDR, we will be not only looking into the actual complying with the actual requirements, but really thinking about the external impact, but also internal impact. So what change that legislation is able to bring internally in the companies, in their preparedness to address sustainability.
It's an important point. Thank you. The lady here.
Thank you so much. Virpi Stuki from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. My question is about cost of compliance and who should pay. I heard SECO mentioning that you have analyzed the cost of the regulation, and the University of Basel, you mentioned that more regulations means more money is needed. Can someone tell anything about the cost and who should pay? Thank you.
The million-dollar question. Let's get some views from all of you. Alex, do you want to start?
I mean, we can talk about the cost, but who should pay, that's another question. And that's just that we respected our time, so now we get the difficult questions. No, I mean, the cost of regulation, that's what we're really analyzing it. And for the CSRD adaptation, well, this will actually we analyzed it. And what I can say for Switzerland, we're talking about a couple of hundred of million of Swiss francs per year, and what is important is half of it is for the verification of the reports by auditing companies. So that's what we found out. So as for the moment in Switzerland, the reports do not have to be audited, but this will change once we are adapting it to the CSRD. Now, who should pay it? Yeah, that's the big question. I would, as a mediator, I'm also a mediator, I would also say we should share the cost between, the different companies along the value chain, maybe, I don't know, the customer, well, but maybe you are from the university.
Well, so you always say all the answers come back to research. Janina, quickly, and then.
Yeah. I think there's a good and important distinction to be made about who should pay and who is likely to pay, sort of the more normative and the more descriptive element. From my normative perspective, I think the ones that should bear the costs are the ones who are most able to in terms of budgets and in terms of capacities, so definitely not the producers at the end. And what we are seeing I study also power dynamics in supply chains and very interested in who passes along costs of compliance. What we have seen in the past, especially with sustainability standards, is that there is to some extent a shifting of costs down to the production level. How can we prevent that from happening? In these types of regulations, some of the costs have to be, well, initially borne internally, right? So like at least with the EUDR, the compliance cost for the producer is not that high. It's much more about, yes, you have to provide the geospatial locations, but the compliance cost of investing in transparent traceability systems and investing in deforestation risk analysis, et cetera, that is borne by the companies that are bound by it. To what extent those will be passed down via lower price to producers or via opportunity costs, especially of being excluded from the supply chain, still an open descriptive question. I have also heard from companies that say eventually it will hit the consumer. It will have to, because margins are not there to bear it internally, and that is sort of like an empirical question that I'll pose in the room. To what extent margins that are already that exist can be used for these types of purposes? I think normatively they should, rather than passing it down to the ends. But yeah, let's see what happens in practice.
Great. We've got to wind this panel up, but we've opened the Pandora's box, which hopefully all of you all can take into the next coffee break with you. But please join me in thanking all our 4 panelists for their views and their inputs. And thank you for joining us.